This house is just filled with Brian things. He also just really loved his family. This is something his brother made. That's his father's desk over here. It's been a real lesson in Brian going through all of his things. Let's see. He wanted to be a writer. You know, if you look at his high school yearbook, that's what he said he wanted to be. But he also was a cartoonist way early on. You know, I grew up with Brian but didn't know him that well. So later in life, when we got back together, I read several of his novels and I read all of his short stories. His cartoons are probably the one thing that track his life the best. Brian also, he had a very self-deprecating humor. He has a quote in here that I love. The lesson I've learned: as a fiction writer, I'm not a bad cartoonist. As a cartoonist, I'm not a bad fiction writer. He traveled probably from 71 to 74, something like that. And when he came back, he went to UMass and got a degree. He started out as sort of an organizer. And later in life, that really came to fruition. He had a cartoon workshop at UMass, and that's where all these cartoonists got together.
You know, when I think of Brian, I'm thinking about all the things Brian facilitated and all the things that happened because he was there, you know, just doing his quiet, self-effacing thing in the background and just making sure it all worked out.
He was the one, you know, that pushed us and kept the whole thing going. I think he was more grown up than the rest of us. Just would stand back and observe things. That's what his cartoons were too. And he was always a character in it. It was always about his experiences. He had a little stamp he'd put on his comics, and it would say, all true, real stuff, no lie. I still say that. You know, when you're telling a story or something like that, and it sounds outrageous, you go, all true, real stuff, no lie. So Brian lives on in that.
Brian's approach to work was not to every student's taste. He would invest a lot, and sometimes when the student arrived and saw his preparation, they could become kind of overwhelmed. But there are many students that really appreciated that, and with those he formed very strong bonds. But that was Brian's whole approach, I think, to life, to friendships, you know, just getting together with a friend and talking about something and talking about deeply and feeling that sense of connection.
We met as kind of street neighbors do, I think, walking by. And we spent some hours on our back porch.
You said it before we came up, he was such a good listener. He was really easy to talk to.
We talked about, you know, grieving, parents, family, politics. How does the Republican brain work? We always had ideas. Yeah, sometimes they're erased by the fourth beer, but...
I brought over one day a book called 1,000 Movies to See Before You Die. And he went through it and he was like, yep. You know, and he had seen all but about 8 of the movies, of the 1,000 movies. When he was like 16 or 15 or something, he woke up on his parents' couch and saw a scene from a foreign movie. He never knew what the movie was, and it drove him crazy. He spent the better part of a year in libraries looking up what movies were played in this marketplace.
He wanted to pinpoint not just the year, but the exact evening and hour that he watched that movie. If he figured that out, like when this movie played on television and when he saw it, he could then put it into this big context of what was happening in his life, what was happening in his family at that time, and why did that movie have the impact that it did because of that. That was his ultimate goal, to achieve that kind of an insight.
Brian was always deeper into things than I could be. I couldn't get him to stop deferring to me. It's true, I was 20 years older, and I had gone to a fancy Ivy League college. He always deferred to me, and I literally would tell him to stop talking to me that way, Brian. because Brian was one of the most intelligent guys I've ever met. I mean, his head was just full of information. He was more than just a repository of information. I just plain enjoyed his company, and I think he enjoyed my company. What can I say? I just considered him a dear friend and somebody I so admired.
I came to town in 1980, September. Went to a party within the first 3 days I was here. And the party was pretty good. It was actually Brian's sister Jill that was throwing the party. I met Brian out on the porch, and actually Brian helped me a lot because I was sort of wandering around not knowing what I was doing. I'd just arrived here, like I say, and he gave me a few jobs doing illustrations for The Advocate. From that point on, we just hung out together. I relied on Brian as a kind of sounding board for so many different things. I would sort of tag on to his moral compass. I'd come to see him. Brian, such and such is happening, or I've been thinking about this, or I've been doing that, and I would know that I would get some valuable feedback from a person that I trusted as much as I trusted my own dad. That was one of the beautiful things about hanging out with Brian, is that you could just talk for ages. We would have long conversations. I'm talking about decades ago. I'm talking about just a few months ago. I think it was probably about a month before he died. On this one particular day, we had this really long conversation. And Marsh has asked me, what was it you said to Brian that day? What was it that you guys were discussing? I said, it's really hard to sort of to recreate it now, because it was like one of those things in the moment, And we were talking about how life is just this morass of life. Everything is alive. We're just part of it. We're like little nuclei in something else, and everything is just. And we got talking about that. But when Brian stood up and said he was getting tired and he was coming back in the house, I tied the guy out. He said, kind of almost flippantly, I thought at the time, "John, that was a good conversation, and that made me feel pretty good about things right now."
As I find out even now more about Brian, I go, well, that makes perfect sense, because,
Oh, he wrote books? Oh, yeah, he wrote books.
Oh, he was
Was he a
involved.
college professor? I didn't know that for the longest time.
Yeah, there's
Okay,
the
I
old
can
thing
see that.
about somebody being, a river being, a mile wide and a foot deep. Brian was really more like a mile wide and 100 feet deep.
Looking out at the yard there, noticing like how big this yard is. I'd never paid attention to the yard because every time I came here to see Brian, he was usually sitting under this tree with a pile of books, and he already had a chair for me to sit on, and he would be talking right away about whatever he was reading, or I would ask him, "What are you reading?" He never gave you like a one word or one sentence answer. He would immediately like start with the context and then work his way to his point. But it's like we never made it past the tree here. I imagine a lot of people have that memory of Brian sitting under this tree with a pile of books.